In this section, I'm going to talk to you about Ansible's inventory system. Ansible has a system for storing variables about devices that you're trying to connect to. By default, Ansible is going to look in a file in etc Ansible hosts. Frequently, I'll actually overwrite the default location and not show it, not store it just in the etc directory. Instead, I'll modify this Ansible config file. So I'll modify this .ansible.cfg. I'll tell it to look in a different location for my Ansible inventory file. So here I say, look in my home directory for a file called ansible-hosts, and that's where it's now going to look to try to find my inventory information. So now if I look in my current home directory, let me move the current Ansible hosts to a different file. And now let's start constructing an Ansible inventory file. So the most basic, one of the most basic inventory files I could create, I would just specify a local group, and I would add an entry in for localhost. And typically I'm going to specify this with this additional argument Ansible_connection equal local. Now what that Ansible_connection equal local does is it says for any host entry that has this, don't try to actually SSH to the box. Actually, it knows that it's going to be on the local machine that the module is going to execute, so it basically doesn't need to go through this process of trying to SSH the information to that box. It just does it all locally. So now if we look at this inventory information, I have two things. I have my group definition. I also have the information about each particular device. Now here I only have one device. I have localhost, and it has this additional variable Ansible connection equals local. Now if I go and run a simple Ansible command, I could say Ansible localhost, and I could execute the ping module and try to ping this module or ping this machine using Ansible. And we see that that works correctly. I could also operate on the group and say, let's do the ping action, but we'll do it in the group. Now the group only has one member, this local host entry. Now what if we start expanding this to add some Cisco devices? So let's make a group called Cisco. We'll add a PyNet router 1 and a PyNet router 2. Now these are identifiers to name the particular host. So here's the tag identifying PyNet router 1, here's the tag identifying PyNet router 2. Now these could be fully qualified domain names, or they could be DNS names that could be looked up in some way. Frequently with network devices, I won't be doing that. I will actually add this additional argument, this Ansible_host, and then I'll specify the host name or the IP. So in this case, I'm going to specify 184.105.247.70. Similarly for this guy, I'm going to specify 184.105.247.71. Now you can specify variables that are shared for all members of the group using this Cisco:\vars entry. So this is for the group Cisco, and these are variables that apply to all members of that group. And we're going to do a username equals this, password equals that. I also want to specify a Python interpreter. So I'm going to grab this from my old file, but I want to specify where to find Python. And let me grab this from up here. I'll grab these two actually. So now remember when we talked about Ansible in the earlier lecture when I went over sort of the overview of how Ansible operates. I remember I said Python's expecting to ship this module to a remote machine. And when you think of that model of this distributed system, you might want to basically be explicit, or you frequently want to be explicit about which Python you want to use. Do you want to use userbin Python, or do you want to use a different Python? So here I'm basically saying I want to use the Python from this virtual environment. Why do I want to use the Python from this virtual environment? Because I know it has all the dependencies that I want, i.e. the Python modules that I want are installed in that Python. So I'm basically being explicit about which Python I want to use for any modules that get executed by these hosts. Now once again, since these are networking devices, I'm going to say Ansible connection equal local. I'm not going to try to ship the module to these two Cisco routers. I'm going to run the module on the Ansible control machine. The module will then make the SSH connections. Okay, now let's go back to our ping command, and let's not execute it against local, but let's execute it against the Cisco group. And here we see, okay, I can ping PyNet router 1, I can ping PyNet router 2. Now remember, this is the Ansible ping module, and it really here is only talking to localhost. So it's transferring the module to localhost, it's executing it, and then you're getting the JSON response back. But it's not actually connecting to the remote device yet at this point. But that is telling me that I have my inventory set up correctly. So now, if I start to construct a playbook, let's convert this into a playbook format. So we'll do now remember at the top of the playbooks, I'm going to start specifying things like name. Name is a string that's going to get printed when I display the playbook. So I'll just say simple ping here. Now here I specify the hosts that I want this playbook to execute against. So the hosts are going to be the Cisco group. And now I'm going to specify my tasks. My tasks are going to be the modules that I'm going to execute. And here I'm just going to execute the ping module, and it doesn't have any arguments. So this is basically the exact same thing we saw with the Ansible command, but now I'm structuring it in a playbook format. And if you remember from our discussions on playbook, the playbook is written in YAML. It has this combination of plays, which are this highest level list entry, and then inside a play it has tasks. Here I only have a single task. I'm just going to use this ping module. Okay, so now let's run this playbook and see if it executes properly. Okay, so we see it executes. If we add the -v for more verbose, we'll see that we get this JSON back corresponding to the execution of the module. Okay, so that's all fine and good. We're still just entirely connecting locally, but we've started to set up our inventory. So we've started to add that in this Ansible hosts file. So if I go back into Tilde and I start expanding on Ansible hosts, let's go ahead and make an Arista entry. Copy 2 of these, and I think I have a couple of Arista switches. So I have 4 of them. They start at 72, 73, 74, 75. Now let's go ahead and do... I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of changes here. So by default, there's an all group, which applies to all of the entries. I'm going to create some variables that apply to all these entries. So since we have only networking devices, I know that I always want Ansible connection to equal local. And I know for in the context of what we're doing here, I always want to use this Python associated with my virtual environment. Now I'll go down here and I'll make a couple of arista vars, and I'll just copy these two variables here and use the same username and password there. So now I've started to add more elements to the inventory. I have a few groups. I have a local group, I have a Cisco group, I have an Arista group. I have a few individual entries like localhost, PyNet router 1, PyNet router 2, PyNet switch 1, PyNet switch 2, etc. Now, if we go in here and we change my playbook to simple PB, now Ansible also has a debug module. And one thing that's nice about debug is you can print out the contents of variables. So let's go and look at this variable Ansible underscore host and see what we get. Now let's look at our playbook here. Triple hash at the top indicates we're writing YAML. Name is an identifier for this particular play. Also will print out this message, print out variables to the screen. We're operating again on the Cisco group. We get down to here and we're going to actually use the debug module at this point. And then the debug module actually has some additional arguments associated with it. It has this message argument and the variable associated with the message argument. Now this could be a string, so like for example, let's comment this out for a second, and let's just print a string. And then let's run this. Okay, so we see that we get this message some string, and we get it twice, once for each of the two Cisco routers. Now, instead, if I wanted to print out a variable, now notice here I say MSG colon, this is a key value pair in YAML. Now, I put a quote here, and the reason I can't just do it this way is Ansible doesn't like this because it doesn't know here if you're just writing a dictionary or if you're referring to a variable. So if you want to refer to a variable, you generally put it in quotes and then you use the Jinja 2 style of referencing variables. We're going to talk quite a bit more about Jinja 2 in this course, but for now just take it from me that the Jinja 2 style of referencing variables is you just put this double curly brace around it. So here I'm going to reference the variable known as Ansible underscore host. Where did that Ansible underscore host variable come from, or where is it coming from? It's coming from our inventory. So if we look at our inventory, here we see we have the Ansible underscore host variable. Okay, we rerun our playbook, and now we see this Ansible host is getting updated. Now, what if we expand our playbook and say, let's not only look at the Cisco group, we can also add the Arista group. We put in a colon here to indicate we're going to use multiple groups. And we run it for both of them. Now we see all 6 of those devices. Now you could also make this be not just a group, but a particular device. So we could say, I want to run it on the Cisco group and PyNet switch 1, and then we'll print out, in this case, those 3 devices. Now if we wanted to print out multiple variables, we could have multiple tasks. So let's say we wanted to print out the username variable, and let's say we also wanted to print out the password variable. Execute that playbook, and we see we get each one of those. Here's our IP address, here's our username, here's our password. We now have a simple playbook, has a single play, and it has 3 tasks inside of it. And we've started to construct this Ansible inventory file.